You decide to rent a room in the local inn after participating in some rather shady activities. After laying down to rest and just barely falling asleep, you feel as if you are not alone. As you awake, you are approached by a cloaked figure who says to you,
"You sleep rather soundly for a murderer."
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing the Dark Brotherhood. More specifically, what exactly caused the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood. To do this, we are first going to have to go over a few things, starting with who are the Dark Brotherhood, their origins, so what are the important rules of the organization, the legalities of this organization, and how they manage to keep themselves running. Then we will move on to discuss the history of the Dark Brotherhood, so what historical events has this organization been involved in. After this, we will discuss the important members of the Dark Brotherhood, those who have helped keep it running, and those who have inched it closer to its downfall. Finally, we will talk about the practices and the rituals of the Dark Brotherhood. So how do they recruit? How do you summon them? Along with the various rituals that are embedded in the sort of religion that comes with this dark guild. So let us begin with who the Dark Brotherhood are. The Dark Brotherhood are a faction of assassins that have a less than legal status. Their existence allegedly coming from a fracturing and splitting off from the more permitted Morag Tong Guild, which are another group of assassins that are legal over in Morrowind. This most likely occurring when the Morag Tong became illegal throughout most of Tamriel, as some who worked as assassins were not exactly willing to give up their career in the regions outside of Morrowind, nor would they be willing to relocate to Morrowind. If we look at the iconography of the Dark Brotherhood, the more likely story of the Dark Brotherhood and its origins is the story of the Night Mother. So this story goes that not long after the assassination of Potentate Versidu Sha'i in the year 324 in the Second Era is when the Morag Tong became illegal. The former Night Mother of the Morag Tong would begin to hear voices. Now this voice in her head that she would begin hearing was not just any voice. Instead, it is believed to be the voice of none other than Sithis. And Sithis was rather disappointed with the achievements of the Morag Tong. Sithis would tell the Night Mother that he was still hungry for more souls. Sithis would visit her bedchamber and the Night Mother would have 5 children. Then 2 years would just pass by. After these 2 years, in the dead of night, the Night Mother would do as Sithis wished, and would give him more souls. These souls being the souls of her 5 children. Yes, she murdered her children and sent their souls straight to Sithis, to the void. Now, the small village was horrified. How could a mother do such a thing to their own children, they thought. Now, this village would rally and would desire vengeance for those poor, innocent souls. So, they would kill the woman and burn down the house where all of this darkness took place. Now, that would seem like the end of the tragedy. However, with something this dark, it would only linger, waiting. And just over 30 years later, a man would begin to hear a strange but comforting voice in his own head. However, it would not be Sithis this time. Instead, it would be a woman, the Night Mother. She would name this man the Listener, setting him the task of building a new organization, known as the Dark Brotherhood. This organization would provide the souls for Sithis, and the assassinations would provide the services that were missing from Tamriel, now that the Morag Tong were outlawed throughout most of its provinces. So the Dark Brotherhood are not a legal group, which would make you think that they would be heavily pursued by the law. However, in most cases, they have been ignored or somewhat accepted, this being on the same sort of level with the Thieves Guild throughout Tamriel. Both are not the most legal, but they are not actively pursued by the law. On occasions where they have had issues with the law, like in the Third Era in the year 417, when a minor noble was close to discovering the location of the Nightside Asylum, the minor noble was assassinated, so they essentially try to clean up messes. So the Dark Brotherhood does not take its safety lightly when it comes to outsiders, especially those who may desire to disband the organization. The Dark Brotherhood is described as a group who are vicious foes to those who follow the roads of law. Although this group is not known to follow laws imposed on them by the Empire or the provinces, they do strictly follow the laws created to govern and control the Dark Brotherhood, these being the 5 tenets. The 5 tenets are a rule set that guides the behavior of the Dark Brotherhood members towards their fellow Dark Brotherhood members. Now, the 5 tenets are 1. Never dishonor the Night Mother. To do so is to invoke the wrath of Sithis. 2. Never betray the Dark Brotherhood or its secrets. To do so is to invoke the wrath of Sithis. 3. Never disobey or refuse to carry out an order from a Dark Brotherhood superior. To do so is to invoke the wrath of Sithis. 4. Never steal the possessions of a Dark Brother or Dark Sister. To do so is to invoke the wrath of Sithis. And 5. Never kill a Dark Brother or Sister. To do so is to invoke the wrath of Sithis. Now, the phrase invoke the wrath of Sithis sounds like a simple metaphor, where the deity of the Dark Brotherhood would obviously hate you for your behavior. But this is not the case. When you break one of these tenets, very specific things happen. Firstly, you are exiled from the Dark Brotherhood for your behavior. Then you meet the wrath of Sithis. Now, this is not a fate you can escape. What seems to occur is the next time you go to sleep after you have been exiled, you are attacked in your dreams by none other than the wrath of Sithis. If you manage to defeat the wrath of Sithis, then you have earned your place back in the Dark Brotherhood. But it is rumored that the tenets are no longer followed in the 4th era. So based on all of this, what caused the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood? Well, the Dark Brotherhood as a group are a part of the criminal underbelly of Tamriel. For the most part, they were ignored by the politicians and the law enforcement side of Tamriel, as the Dark Brotherhood were a means to an end for many disputes, even used by the leaders of various provinces within Tamriel. However, with this comes the issue of their legality. As the Dark Brotherhood were not a legal guild, there is the issue that this group is not protected. So disputes between members could not be handled in a court of law or in a more simple way, which is why when members were caught doing things that were considered punishable, the harshest penalties were enforced. This being done as a sort of deterrent for others. But considering the death penalty for something as simple as disobedience, it is hard to encourage loyalty from those who do not truly believe in the cause and are afraid of the punishments. It is also very hard to increase membership. You know, oh, we'll kill you if you don't follow. Not exactly getting me to sign up anytime soon. But this is only part of the Dark Brotherhood. To better understand what caused the downfall of this guild, we need to discuss their history. For the history of the Dark Brotherhood, we should begin with the earliest record of the guild. This being in the Second Era in the year 358, over in the village of Yalenheim in Skyrim. This is where a note would be found under the floorboards of an abandoned house. This house belonged to a cobbler. Now, there were rumours spread by some members of the town that the cobbler was actually a member of the Morak Tong, which had been outlawed throughout most of Tamriel 34 years ago. Now, the cobbler would just suddenly disappear. However, his house was undisturbed. Nothing packed, nothing ransacked. It was almost as if, with the click of someone's fingers, he just disappeared. The only strange thing that would be found is a note that stated, "Brother, I still call you brother, for we share our bonds of blood, tested but unbroken by hatred. Even if I am murdered, which seems inevitable now, know that, brother, you and I are not innocents. So our benedictions of mutual enmity is not tragedy, but horror. This state of silent shadowed war, of secret poisons and sleeping men, strangled in their beds, of the sudden arrow and the artful dagger, has no end that I can see, no possibility for peace. I see the shadows in the room move, though the flame of my candle is steady. I know the signs that and the note cuts off with just a single drop of blood, marking the note, hinting that the fate he met was no natural death. The brother he feared found him. This is the first suggestion of the Dark Brotherhood, with what seems to be a former colleague assassinating the other. The next hint at existence that we would have is also from the Second Era, but in the year 412. This being with the journal of Queen Alimahira of Hegath. We would see her mention her and her family employing the Dark Brotherhood as a way of disposing those who got in their way, when they couldn't do it themselves. Thus telling us that the Dark Brotherhood, although they are typically seen as a criminal organization, they do have ties to the law and royalty throughout Tamriel. But anyway, moving on to the year 582, still in the Second Era. In this year, we would see an increase in the activity of the Dark Brotherhood in the Gold Coast, as they would kill many notable nobles, making themselves known in the area, even going as far as assassinating the self-proclaimed provincial governor of Anvil, this being Fortunata ap Dugal, and the head of the Order of the Power, Primate Artorius. However, with the boldness of the Dark Brotherhood, they would find themselves blamed for the deaths of others that they had no hand in. The organization was set up to take the fall for several other high-profile murders, these being the deaths of several of the Elder Council members in Leowin. Around this time, with the increase in activity during this time, Dark Brotherhood would set out to re-establish an old sanctuary within Bloodrun Cave. This sanctuary was no normal sanctuary. It also housed an honorable tomb where many deceased Dark Brotherhood members and Shadowscale members had been buried before it was abandoned. With this sanctuary being the re-established base for the Dark Brotherhood, the Vestige, along with Iveli Sharp Arrow, would head into the sanctuary to question the Dark Brotherhood about their involvement with the assassinations. This duo would meet with Elam Drowse, who would confirm that they had no hand in these assassinations. As it would turn out, another cult would be committing these murders. However, this meeting would be ended abruptly, with the presence of the Order of the Waking Flame secretly looming in the area. The Bloodrun Cave sanctuary would be attacked. The Order of the Waking Flame would use Daedric portal magic to launch their attack on the Dark Brotherhood. This would lead to many of the Dark Brotherhood assassins dying in the ambush. With this attack on the Dark Brotherhood, it would lead to more clues about who was the cult actually killing the counselors. This cult that was doing the assassinations instead being the followers of Mehrunes Dagon, known as the Order of the Waking Flame. Yes, the same cult that ambushed the Dark Brotherhood were the ones committing the assassinations. The remaining Dark Brotherhood members would not take this ambush lightly, with Elam Drowse and the Vestige helping to defend Fort Redmane against the attacking Dagon cultists. This would prevent Mehrunes Dagon from claiming the fort and part of Blackwoods for his realm in Oblivion. But anyway, moving on to the year 41 in the Third Era. This is where the Dark Brotherhood would surface again. They would be hired to kill the grandson of Tiber Septim, this being Pelagius I, who was the emperor at the time of his death, having ruled the empire for less than 3 years. The Dark Brotherhood would be hired by an unknown enemy to assassinate Emperor Pelagius, and this assassination would occur whilst Pelagius was knelt down in prayer at the Temple of the One over in the Imperial City. Jumping forward to around the year 325 in the Third Era. This is where it was believed that an internal power struggle within the Dark Brotherhood would decimate the organization's numbers. This was suggested to have occurred due to a vicious internal power struggle, this potentially surrounding Mehrunes Razor. However, this drop in numbers did not last long, as in the year 405 in the Third Era, the Dark Brotherhood would have a strong presence in the Iliac Bay region, having a guild hall in almost every town and city by this year, with the organization of this time having its headquarters in the Nightside Asylum. Moving on to the year 417, still in the Third Era, as this is when the location of the Nightside Asylum would be at risk of being discovered by outsiders of the organization, as a low-ranking noble in the Iliac Bay region was close to discovering the location. What is interesting in this sequence of events is that not only would it be Mephala sending an assassin after the noble, but that the request for help would actually go to someone outside of the Dark Brotherhood. So an adventurer would clean up the little mess that would threaten the existence of the Dark Brotherhood. But anyway, moving on to the year 421 in the Third Era. This is when a member of the Dark Brotherhood known as Graywin Blenwith would claim he had received his own visions from Sithis. This vision told Graywin to essentially create his own version of the Dark Brotherhood with only vampiric members to overthrow the Dark Brotherhood. Graywin would infect other members of the Dark Brotherhood, getting them to join his organization, known as the Crimson Scars, doing so in hopes of having enough strength to take out the Black Hand. However, one of the members that he had turned into a vampire, a Dunmer known as Solarian, would remain loyal to the Dark Brotherhood and would inform the members of the Dark Brotherhood of the plan. This would lead to the purification ritual being ordered, which would lead to the Crimson Scars being destroyed, with all but 2 members being killed, the surviving members being Rowley Eared Wolf and of course Graywin. Moving on to the year 427. This is when the Dark Brotherhood would attempt to gain more territory in Morrowind, more specifically in the island of Vardenfell, as they were already a rather popular service in mainland Morrowind. However, with the Morag Tong having a foothold on the island of Morrowind, it would make it harder for them to gain any ground. So the Dark Brotherhood would make friends with the local Mehrunes Dagon cultists, hoping that they would provide them shelter from what would be the angry Morag Tong members. This, however, would lead to the assassinations of many Dagonites and Dark Brotherhood members, along with the leader of the Dark Brotherhood within Vardenfell, this being the Night Mother, Severia Magia. However, this would not completely wipe wipe out the Dark Brotherhood, just the chapter that attempted to encroach on the Moragtong territory. We know this as during the same year, we would see the Dark Brotherhood supposedly hired by King Helseth. King Helseth would hire the Dark Brotherhood to take out the Naravarine, as he was worried that the Naravarine would challenge Helseth's rule. Now, the Naravarine would manage to track down the local leader of the Dark Brotherhood, Dandrus Vuls, killing him along with the majority of the Dark Brotherhood in Mournhold. Here, the Naravarine would discover a contract between the Night Mother and someone known as H, indicating Helseth. When Helseth would be confronted by the Naravarine, Helseth would claim that the attacks on the Naravarine from the Dark Brotherhood were due to misinformation about the threat that the Naravarine posed to the monarchy. With this, it seemed like the Dark Brotherhood interactions with the Naravarine would cease. However, this is not what would occur, as the Dark Brotherhood would make one final attempt, but not on the Naravarine, instead this being on Berenzia, the mother of Helseth. The Naravarine would swoop in and save Queen Berenzia, seemingly stopping any further attacks in Mournhold at that time. Now, moving on to the year 433 and over to Cyrodiil. This would be a difficult time for the Dark Brotherhood, as it seemed as if group were being dismantled and killed off by a betrayal from one of their members. This was due to the Dark Brotherhood member, Matthew Bellamont, actually desiring revenge against the Dark Brotherhood. Now, what is interesting about this entire situation is that when Matthew was a child, his parents would split. He would go on to live with his mother. Matthew's father was not happy with the split, so he would contact the Dark Brotherhood, requesting that they get rid of his wife. Matthew would watch one of the Dark Brotherhood members, this being Lucien Lachance, behead his mother. This would be the beginnings of a long plan for revenge against Lachance. Matthew would quickly rise through the ranks as a member of the Dark Brotherhood. With this, he would start killing off members of the Dark Brotherhood. As the Dark Brotherhood were unsure about who or what was causing all of these deaths, they would order the newcomer, this being the hero of Kvatch, to complete the ritual of purification at the Cheydinhal Sanctuary. However, this purification ritual would not cleanse the Brotherhood of their little issue. Out of precaution, after the purification ritual, Lachance would give orders via dead drop. But to avoid people becoming aware of his plan, Matthew would begin to switch the dead drops of Lucien Chance's silencer, making sure the dead drop contract was actually a member of the Black Hand. This would lead to the members of the Black Hand becoming suspicious about Lachance, believing that he was actually the one purposefully causing the deaths of their members. So they would kill Lachance, torturing him. Eventually, Lachance would be revealed as innocent, and the real villain would be revealed. It was actually Matthew Bellamont who was causing these deaths. And with this, he would kill 2 more members of the Dark Brotherhood before being killed. But anyway, moving on. This being into the 4th era, which would also not be kind to the Dark Brotherhood in the next 200 years. There would be much chaos due to the Great War, this being the war between the Empire and the Third Aldmeri Dominion, tearing through parts of Tamriel. The Dark Brotherhood would lose several of its sanctuaries, with the first to go being Bruma. Wayrest would fall 2 years later, the sanctuary being destroyed with no survivors managing to make it out. In the year 188, in the 4th era, the Dark Brotherhood would only have 3 surviving sanctuaries, these being Cheydinhal in Cyrodiil, one in the remote forest area over in Skyrim, and Corinth Sanctuary in Elsewhere. With the riots and war over the city by skooma traffickers in Bravil, it became more and more dangerous to house the Night Mother there in her crypt. Several members from Cheydinhal would head over to the crypt to defend it in case it was discovered. However, 20 days later, only one of these members would return, with the stone coffin that housed the Night Mother. But even with the presence of the Night Mother, a new year and 2 months after her arrival, there would be no new listener declared after the previous died defending the crypt. This would lead to an old tradition of the Dark Brotherhood being revived, this tradition being the Keeper of the Night Mother, which would lead to Cicero being appointed the caretaker of the body of the Night Mother, partaking in rituals to encourage the Night Mother to choose a new listener to speak to. The months would pass and no listener would be declared, this being until the final month of the year 189 in the 4th era, where one of the members, Rasha, would declare themselves as a listener, claiming that the Night Mother had finally spoken to them. However, when questioned by Cicero, Rasha could not tell them the binding words, and this is where Cicero would encourage another member of the Dark Brotherhood, Garnag, to kill Rasha. This would leave only 3 members remaining at Cheydinhal. The silence of the Night Mother would continue, and Cicero would grow more and more deranged. Then, in the year 191, the number of members would shrink again at Cheydinhal, with Pontius being killed by a bandit whilst he walked the city streets. Several months later, Garnag would also disappear, potentially abandoning the Dark Brotherhood. 9 years later, in the year 200 in the 4th era, Cicero would attempt to contact Astrid over in the Skyrim Sanctuary. In this journal entry, he claims that the Dark Brotherhood there do not follow the old ways, as they have no listener, so no way of hearing the Black Sacraments. Cicero would then decide to make a journey with the Night Mother over to Skyrim. Cicero would eventually take the Night Mother to the Falkreath Sanctuary in hopes that it would return them to their old ways. It is unknown what would happen to the Dark Brotherhood, but there are rumours. Some claiming that Cicero would make it to the Falkreath Sanctuary, whereas there is another claim that the sanctuary was destroyed before Cicero ever arrived. Either way, the Falkreath Sanctuary would be destroyed on the command of the Penitus Oculatus organization, and if Cicero had made it to Falkreath, this destruction would come from betrayal. The former leader of Falkreath, Astrid, would grow jealous of the last Dragonborn and the Night Mother, so she would sell the sanctuary out to the Penitus Oculatus organization. Astrid wanted things to return to normal, however she and many other members would end up dead due to her jealousy. It is said that with this attack, with either way it went down, between 2 to 4 members of the Dark Brotherhood would survive. So what does the history tell us about the Dark Brotherhood's downfall? Well, if we look at the 3rd era, the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood sort of snowballs from here, with the year 427 being important in the disputes over territory with the Morag Tong, which would lead to the numbers shrinking. Along with this, in the year 433, we would see the internal disputes affecting the numbers of members within the Dark Brotherhood, this leading to a purification ritual and ongoing deaths afterwards, with the death of an innocent member who was blamed for the assassinations. Now, what is interesting about this is the Night Mother will admit to knowing about the entire situation, claiming that she allowed it to happen without informing anyone or intervening in any way. For some, it may have made them feel as if the so-called head of the organization that they worshipped saw them as nothing but expendable pawns for her own entertainment, leading to some members potentially not trusting in their leader. Along with this, if we look at the events of the 4th era, now with these events, we would see the death of the listener defending the crypt of the Night Mother. With this, the Night Mother would then refuse to name a new listener to take over from the deceased one, leading to the reviving of an ancient ritual known as the Keeper. The Keeper being a member of the Dark Brotherhood who cares for the Night Mother. This being done in hopes of encouraging the Night Mother to talk. However, with the Night Mother refusing to talk, it led to the remaining members within the Cyrodiil Sanctuary becoming disheartened, and also led to members distrusting each other, further leading to the shrinking in size of the sanctuary and the eventual closure. With this, we would also see the Keeper of the Night Mother, known as Cicero, growing mad from the desperation and isolation caused by the situation, being more and more disappointed by the Night Mother's refusal to talk to him. Along with this, we would see the leader of Skyrim Sanctuary's jealousy and willingness to betray the Brotherhood for control. So the Dark Brotherhood's downfall, based on the history, was a combination of external events putting pressure on the members, along with the members who desired to control or destroy the Dark Brotherhood for their own gain. But this is only one piece of the puzzle. Better understand their downfall, we need to discuss the important members of the Dark Brotherhood. When it comes to the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood, there are several characters that should be considered throughout the eras. For this, we should start with one who actually tried to protect the organization and keep it running, this being Cicero. Now, Cicero was the keeper of the Night Mother, but it's not where he started. We don't know much about Cicero before the year 186 in the 4th era, as this is when he would begin writing his journal. At the very beginning of Cicero keeping record, he would flee the Bruma Sanctuary, which was destroyed, heading for the sanctuary at Cheydinhal. At this time, the Night Mother was not present in the Bruma Sanctuary, instead being housed in her crypt in Bravil. However, things would come to a head when she would be brought back to Cheydinhal Sanctuary due to the dangers of Bravil in the year 188, leading to the listener passing away. Now, why does this matter when it comes to Cicero and his attempting to protect the Dark Brotherhood? Well, Cicero would, after a year of no one being named the new listener, be declared the keeper of the Night Mother. He would take this role after one last assassination, the final assassination being of a jester, which he discusses throughout his journal. After completing this contract, Cicero becomes the keeper of the Night Mother. performing rituals to encourage the Night Mother to talk to a new listener. However, even with the care Cicero would take looking after the Night Mother, she would not speak to him, nor would she speak to anyone else. And as time would pass, Cicero would end up alone, taking care of the Night Mother with no one to talk to. Over time, Cicero would begin to take on the persona of his last kill, the Jester. Hearing his laugh, he would begin to go mad from the loneliness and the desperation of his situation. Cicero would later be set on bringing the Night Mother and the Old Ways over to Skyrim and their Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, as Cicero believed he had to show the leader of this sanctuary the error in their ways. He believed that this would allow him to find a listener and help to restore the Dark Brotherhood. So Cicero believed that the Old Ways could save the Dark Brotherhood. However, there were opponents to the Old Ways, like that of Astrid. Astrid was the leader of the last remaining Dark Brotherhood sanctuary in Tamriel in the 4th era. Now, as Astrid did not follow the Old Ways, there was no listener, meaning that the Dark Brotherhood was run more like an organization of murderers for hire. Yes, they did claim to worship Sithis, however many of their typical practices had died out. We see this with Astrid. Although she welcomed Cicero and the Night Mother, she claimed that her word was the law, showing that she intended to keep the organization running how she had previously had it running. We see Astrid's desire for control over the Dark Brotherhood and the organization to remain the way she had, with her selling out the last Dragonborn to Penitus Oculatus, as Astrid was told that the Dark Brotherhood would go back to their previous ways, however being lied to. So Astrid's jealousy and desire for power would leave the Dark Brotherhood vulnerable to outside attacks, and would leave many members dead, even leading to Astrid's request for a mercy killing. But what about other internal threats? Well, when it comes to the internal threats, there were actually two main players in the 3rd era. The first being Graywyn Blenwith. So Graywyn became a vampire during the 2nd era around the year 582. Now, the first record of his joining of the Dark Brotherhood in the 3rd era is around the year 421. This is also when Graywyn would claim he would begin hearing Sithis. However, he would not hear him through words but more ideas. The ideas that Sithis would give him was that he must form his own group within the Dark Brotherhood known as the Crimson Scars. This being done through infecting other members with the vampiric disease in hopes of having enough members to overthrow the Black Hand. However, this would not occur, and they would be betrayed by one of the members of the Crimson Scars, this leading to a purification ritual, killing off many of the members. After this betrayal, Graywyn would have a second vision, where he would yet again be spoken to by Sithis, which interestingly enough, Sithis would instead tell Graywyn that he was displeased by his vampiric ways. This would lead Graywyn on a quest to cure his vampirism. So Graywyn would desire to reshape the entire faction based on what he believed were messages from Sithis. This would cause much death due to a purification ritual being demanded to destroy those who were loyal to the Crimson Scars. But Graywyn would not be the only internal threat the Dark Brotherhood would face in the 3rd era, the other being Matthew Bellamont. Matthew, as a child, would watch his mother die at the hands of a Dark Brotherhood member. This leading to a lifelong desire to destroy the group and kill the man who killed his mother. To do this, Matthew would spend much of his time infiltrating the group in an attempt to dismantle it from the inside. His dismantling of the organization would come through the deaths of other members, leaving those who were higher up in the Dark Brotherhood scrambling, trying to figure out what could be causing all of this chaos. This leading to the purification ritual at Cheydon Hall, which Matthew was once a member of. However, he had not been seen there in quite some time, instead living at the lighthouse in the city of Anvil, distancing himself from the group and covering himself in case of suspicion. This would save him from death during the purification ritual and allow him to continue on with his destruction of the Dark Brotherhood, even managing to pin the blame on another higher up member. However, this all coming to a head after a visit to the Night Mother would reveal a traitor still in their midst, and lead to Matthew revealing himself. So what do these important people tell us about the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood? Well, if we look at the conflict between Cicero and Astrid, the values between the different sanctuaries within the Dark Brotherhood vary greatly, this being to a point of betraying and endangering the entire organization. We also see this difference in values coming across in the acts of Greywyn, as he believed that Sithis valued vampires more and had desired to reshape the Dark Brotherhood. But if we look at the acts of Matthew, he desired revenge against the Dark Brotherhood. So I guess one could say he valued vengeance. If we base the downfall on these people, much of the issues arise from differences in values and people within the Brotherhood not being able to agree or see eye to eye. However, this is only one part, not the entire picture. To learn more, we will need to discuss the practices and rituals of the Dark Brotherhood. For the practices and rituals of the Dark Brotherhood, we should first start with the Black Hand. The Black Hand are an important group within the Dark Brotherhood. This group essentially being the head of the organization or the ruling council, containing 5 members, the listener and the 4 speakers. The listener is the member of the Dark Brotherhood who has been chosen by the Night Mother to hear her voice. The listener will then choose one of the speakers to relay the command to, and then the speaker will then pass on the message to who needs to hear it. This is a practice that has been around since the founding of the organization. This group oversees the Brotherhood sanctuaries, allowing for the easy distribution of jobs and the wishes of the Night Mother. This is, however, not the end of the hand, as each of the speakers also happens to have command over their own personal assassin. This is known as the Silencer. The Silencers are considered the best of the best in the assassins of the Dark Brotherhood, and on rare occasion there is also the adoption of an old ritual or practice. This is known as the Keeper. So the Keeper could be considered a member of the Black Hand, as they are also known to work closely with the Night Mother. The Keeper's purpose is to keep the shrine of the Night Mother clean and the candles lit, along with tending to the body of the Night Mother. This is done by washing the Night Mother's body weekly with the required oils whilst reciting ancient incantations. There are other traditions indirectly related to the Black Hand, like that of the purification ritual. This ritual is carried out by the Black Hand and is done to cleanse the organization of mistrust and treachery. Now, there are only 3 recorded cases of the purification ritual being carried out. The first ever purification ritual would occur in the mid-2nd era. This actually being done in the Zith Ezkul Sanctuary, which was built in an Argonian temple in the border region of Black Marsh. Now, the reason for this purification to be carried out is unknown. However, it is known that the ritual would be carried out by Lyra Viria. Viria was an assassin who was from the sanctuary, and she killed all but one other member of that sanctuary, who happened to have been away from the sanctuary for work. Now, Viria would be named the Silencer of Speaker Arwen. Viria would then be sent to Kvatch on her next mission. Viria, however, would be haunted by her actions and would become disillusioned with the Brotherhood, as she had just killed those she had considered to be her family. She would use her skills against the Brotherhood, working to wipe out the members. Viria would kill several members of the Gold Coast Sanctuary, seemingly succeeding in her plan to wipe out the Dark Brotherhood. However, Viria would eventually be caught and would be assassinated, with her soul being dragged to the void by the wrath of Sithis. So there is no known cause for the first purification ritual. However, there was a lasting effect with the first Silencer to complete the ritual. We see this with her decisions to betray the Dark Brotherhood, with her soul in death even being taken by a wrath of Sithis. But there is also slightly less dark practices that surround the Dark Brotherhood, like their recruitment practices. There are multiple ways to be recruited by the Dark Brotherhood. One of these is the Shadow Scales path. This was a tradition where any Argonian born under the sign of the Shadow would be taken to a training facility, being trained in the arts of stealth and assassination. However, in the 4th era, this training facility is known to be closed. Along with this, the last known Shadow Scale, Vizara, would die in the year 201 in the 4th era, meaning that this order of assassins may have actually gone extinct. With those who were not lucky enough to be an Argonian born under the sign of the Shadow, there are other methods of being invited into this organization. So what has changed over the era is the way one is invited. On some occasion, that invite comes in the form of an ominous letter, other times coming in the form of a visit whilst you're sleeping. Both of these invites coming after you have done the unthinkable. No, not stealing your roommate's leftovers, taking the life of an innocent person, as this is what gains the attention of the Night Mother. But what about if you want to hire the Dark Brotherhood, not become them? Well, the way to hire the Dark Brotherhood is the Black Sacrament, a ritual that is said to be heard by the Night Mother herself. This ritual requires an effigy of flesh and bone, with a skull and heart, to be placed in a circle of candles. You then rub a dagger with parts of a nightshade plant and stab the effigy repeatedly. Whilst you stab the effigy, you whisper, sweet mother, send your child unto me, for the sins of the unworthy must be baptized in blood and fear." And now this message, once heard by the Night Mother, will be passed through the Dark Brotherhood until an assassin is sent to begin the contract, which is bound in blood. With this, those who are marked by the Dark Brotherhood are essentially part of a human sacrifice in the worship of Sithis, with their souls being sent to appease the Dread Father. So those who summon the Dark Brotherhood are participating in the religious acts of the Dark Brotherhood. So based on the practices of the Dark Brotherhood, what caused their downfall? Well, if we look at the practice of the Black Hand, we see in the past a case of someone falsely declaring themselves as the listener, which in this case led to them being murdered. The listeners of the Black Hand hold a surprisingly dangerous position, as we have seen the listener also being murdered in the year 433 in the Third Era. This being whilst the Night Mother knew about the plans for his murder without informing him or anyone else about what was truly going on. Along with this, if we look at the outcomes of all the purification rituals, we can see in all of these cases, it technically did not solve the problems that they had set out to. In the first purification, with the reasons for the ritual being performed unknown, the issue would in the end become the Silencer who had performed the ritual, as they would betray the Brotherhood afterwards. In the second and third purification rituals, the actual target of these rituals, these being Graywin and Matthew, would manage to escape death during both of these rituals. Yes, Graywin would eventually stop plotting to overthrow the entire Dark Brotherhood. However, Matthew would not be stopped, instead continuing with his murderous plan. This meaning that the death of all of the Dark Brothers in the Cheydinhal Sanctuary were for nothing. So based on who the Dark Brotherhood are as a faction, their history, the important players, along with the important rituals and practices, what caused the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood? With the Dark Brotherhood being a less than legal faction, their existence within Tamriel was never safe or guaranteed, with various groups pursuing the faction over the eras, like the Noble in the year 417 in the Third Era, who would attempt to find the location of the Nightside Asylum, the Dark Brothers' headquarters. We also see the pursuit occurring much later, with Astrid even selling out the Dark Brotherhood in an attempt to regain control and re-implement her own values in the organization. Even outside of the pursuit of the Dark Brotherhood from various legal entities, the Dark Brotherhood would also face its own internal struggles. We see this with Crimson Scars and Matthew Bellamont in the Third Era. We also see this with the creation of the Black Dragon, this being Lyra Viria. These three events all have the ritual of purification in common, with Lyra Viria becoming the Black Dragon after purifying the sanctuary that she called home, killing those she viewed as family. She would feel guilty about her actions, but would continue to be pushed by the Dark Brotherhood. After this, she would turn on the Dark Brotherhood, aligning with the Order of the Hour, and going on to hunt members of the Dark Brotherhood. The purification in this situation would change a loyal Dark Sister into the hunter of the Dark Brotherhood. And this would not be the only time where there would be issues with the practices of the Dark Brotherhood. The Dark Brotherhood system works through a listener being contacted by the Night Mother about people performing the Black Sacrament. However, with there only being one listener and 4 speakers throughout the entire organization, it requires messages to be passed throughout the different sanctuaries, but not everyone believes in this system, which is what we see in the Fourth Era with Astrid's abandonment of the traditional values of the Black Hand and the Tenets, which would be the cause of many issues, of course, leading to the betrayal of the Dark Brotherhood. So the downfall of the Dark Brotherhood can be considered to be caused by both the external factor of outside groups trying to bring down the Dark Brotherhood due to the faction being illegal, along with the internal disagreements on values and the harshness of the punishment that comes with this. Most specifically, the purification ritual, as with the internal disagreements, it would cause decisions like Astrid selling out the Dark Brotherhood to try regain control. So let me know in the comments what you think was the nail in the coffin for the Dark Brotherhood. As special thank you to all of our law archaeologist supporters. You guys help keep this channel running. And thank you to anyone who is joining our memberships. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one. It is about what exactly caused the Dark Brotherhood to leave the Morag Tong.